Alright, welcome to the third video on chapter number 5. Today we are going to do questions 9 through 12. Questions like, identify Patrick Henry's role in the opposition of the new taxes imposed by Great Britain. I want you to be able to compare a virtual representation with actual representation. We're also going to talk about something called the Declaratory Act. We are finally going to look at a man by the name of Charles Townshend. And how does he help kind of deteriorate the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain? We are going to talk about all this and more in the upcoming segment, so strap in. We're going to make this happen. Okay, let's talk a little bit about kind of where we're at in history right now. We talked about there's a lot of displeasure with the passing of all of these new taxes, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act. All of these things are seen as oppressive by the colonists as a means to take away rights. Some go as far as to even say they're going to eventually enslave them. So they are not happy. There's a lot of displeasure going on. The one good thing that comes out of this is there is this unifying factor among the colonists. Remember we talked last chapter about their inability to agree because of the difference of religion and ethnic background, a reason for coming here. Not a lot of unity. All these taxes, particularly the Stamp Act, really looks to unify the colonies. It really kind of makes them act as one. One guy that kind of sticks out is a man by the name of Patrick Henry, who doesn't ever really make it as a farmer, doesn't make his fortune, but he's a pretty good speaker, and he's good at riling people up. He gets elected to the House of Burgesses in Virginia, which is their colonial assembly, kind of like Congress. And he has this what's called the Virginia Resolution, the Virginia Resolves, I should say. And basically what he said is colonial assemblies can only tax the colonists. They're the only group that really has any responsibility. So Parliament, you're out of order for taxing us when it comes to the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. You can't do it. So only Virginians can tax Virginians. Only people in Pennsylvania can tax Pennsylvania. Now remember, this is a resolve that's proposed in the Virginia House of Burgesses, so he doesn't really kind of worry about what other colonies are doing. They're really only talking about Virginia. He also has this part of the Virginia Resolves where he calls for flat-out disobedience to these taxes. So if somebody comes and wants to collect a tax on your newspaper, or makes you kind of purchase a stamp for your college diploma, that you tell them to, no, I'm not going to do that. Go jump in a lake. I'm not going to do it. Virginia doesn't go as far as to pass this disobedience. However, an interesting thing happens. Other colonies learn of this idea, the Virginia Resolve. Newspapers do something that's a little bit dishonest, is they don't really talk about how Virginia doesn't adopt the idea of disobedience. So when other states see that this happens, they pounce on it, hook, line, and sinker, like, yeah, only Pennsylvanians can tax Pennsylvanians, and all these states start replicating the Virginia Resolves. But because the newspapers don't really say that Virginians, the House of Burgesses has kind of gone away from this idea of disobedience, there are a lot of, or at least a few colonies that adhere the whole thing, disobedience and all. So Patrick Henry is pretty good at kind of moving them in this direction of being inflamed and upset about all the new kind of regulations that the colonies are forced to adhere to by Parliament. With that, there's a lot of groups like the Sons of Liberty who their groups kind of based on protesting the British involvement, the excess of British hand in their lives, in their businesses, their taxes, without any say from the actual colonists. So the Sons of Liberty are this protest group. Now, they protest all sorts of things like prostitution and just all sorts of things. And one night they go a little too far. The opponent is somebody that is the brother-in-law of the local tax collector, the stamp collector in Boston, by the name of Thomas Hutchinson, and they pretty much level his house. And for a group that's really protesting and wants to protect private property, this is seen as going way too far. A lot of Bostonians are like, whoa, what are you doing? The Sons of Liberty kind of condemn these people, saying like, yeah, we're protesting protecting private property, not leveling it. So the Sons of Liberty kind of get their members in order and like let's not do the violence and the the destruction. We don't really need that. It's going to lose. We're going to lose in the court of public opinion, and it's not going to drive our point home. The end result is there is a lot of protest, a lot of disobedience from the Stamp Act. There are stories of stamp collectors that get tarred and feathered. And if you're not sure what that is, it's exactly what it sounds like. They get hot tar poured all over them and they're rolled around in feathers, which is, it sounds ridiculous to do, and obviously it's a nightmare to clean up, but it's pretty painful because hot tar is not, very fun to have poured on your body. That's not an ideal way to go. So it's pretty painful. It's embarrassing. It's messy. It's obviously you're kind of humiliated when it happens. And it hurts. So a lot of people, again, protest, that sort of thing happens. Now, eventually the British government does repeal the Stamp Act. And it really happens kind of not because of all the protests. It really happens in spite of the protests. First of all, George Grenville, the Lord of the Treasury, resigns. And a guy by the name of Marquis de Rockingham takes his place. And Rockingham never liked the idea of the Stamp Act. At the same time, English businesses, remember, are kind of being boycotted by those in the colonists. So there's not a strong call for goods. So the English businesses are starting to feel the pinch. So they're pressuring government to repeal the Stamp Act. All of that kind of leads to this repeal. Okay, so the Stamp Act kind of goes away. Now, there's an idea at the time. Remember, one of the big kind of complaints is there was no say in those taxes. So that no taxation without representation. There was no direct representatives. Now, George Grenville, when he was in office, kind of argues that absolutely the colonists are represented. It's a thing he calls a virtual representation. Basically meaning that members of parliament are representing everybody underneath the British flag. Everybody in the British Empire is being represented by Parliament, even if those members are not elected by the colonists. They're still being represented. Their interests are still being considered. So he kind of poo-poos this idea of there's no representation. What people in the colonists think is they don't like this idea of virtual representation. They want what they call actual representation. Like, I want to be able to have a say on who my representative is. So if they don't do something I don't like, I'm not going to vote for them next time. So they're a little more, drawn to me. They're tied to my ideals and what I want. There's some accountability there. Okay, this kind of goes on. Okay, there's other things that are happening in Parliament as well. They passed something, again, that's forced on the colonists, something called the Declaratory Act, where it basically reinforces this idea that Parliament has the idea to tax whatever they want, whenever they want, in the colonies, in any kind of British holding, in Britain itself. So this is kind of their way of saying, hey, yeah, we did away with the Stamp Act, but let's not get too crazy. We do have the right to kind of do whatever we kind of, whatever kind of tax we want to place on you, we can. And again, you are represented. Now, when Rockingham kind of leaves as the Lord of the Treasury, William Pitt of the 7 Years' War or French Indian War fame takes over. He's really loved in the colonies because of his role in the war. And he's also admired because he also is not a fan of the Stamp Act. He was spoke in kind of objection about it. He really kind of sees this idea of representation the way the colonists do, that actual representation is the only way they really can have a say. And he has this somewhat famous kind of exchange in Parliament with George Grenville when he was still kind of in power, where George Grenville asks, when did the colonists become emancipated? When did they when did they stop being British citizens and under British rule? And William Pitt fires back, I wasn't aware of the date that they became enslaved. So when did they completely lose their rights? So there is, again, this thought that maybe Just maybe the British government's taking away some of those beloved rights from the colonists. Now, William Pitt eventually dies, and King George III, who is, kind of was lucky that he had a couple of lords of the treasury that got along with the colonies and kind of smoothed things over. Not so lucky on his replacement in the late 1600s, a guy by the name of Charles Townshend, who comes in, and just like George Grenville, his thought is, we really want to profit on the colonies. Like, we need to draw some money. There's no reason we shouldn't be making some bank off these guys. So he passes something called the Townshend Acts, which basically allows the British Empire to tax lead, paint, paper, tea, and glass. So anytime you buy like glass or tea or paper or paint or lead, you're going to pay a tax to the British that's going to go to the British government. This is, again, not something that is widely widely loved in the colonies. They don't like it at all. Townshend also decides that he is going to kind of show his authority, and he kind of picks a fight with the New York Assembly. He figures this is kind of the way to go. They are failing to enforce the Quartering Act, so they're not putting British troops that are in the area up with reasonable accommodations, places to stay. So he suspends the New York Assembly. Says, like, if you're not going to play by the rules, then you don't have the right to have an elected assembly to set rules for yourself. This is his way of kind of showing his authority, for sure. The other thing he does is royal officials that are located in the colonies initially were paid at the discretion of the colonial assemblies. So they raised the funds, they paid the royal official salary, which made for a kind of unifying kind of relationship. So those royal officials weren't super anxious to kind of pressure the assemblies. They had kind of a cozy relationship, and it was a little bit of power that the assemblies had over some of the royal officials. Where Charles Townshend, when he came into office, said, this isn't going to happen anymore. I don't like this. He puts a stop to the payment of royal officials. This is their official paycheck. He puts a stop into the assemblies being the one that issue kind of their pay, and instead directs funds that come from the duties off the lead and the paint and the tea to go to royal officials. Hence, they'll be more loyal towards the British government. So this is his way, again, his way of kind of controlling the colonists. This is just another step and another movement to inch closer and closer and closer to this idea of revolution and this idea of, let's become an independent country. This isn't working for us. It's just another step. And Charles Townshend really helps to kind of move the ball down the field in this regard. Okay, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. If not, I will be in touch with the next video.